The Romulans' first doctrine wasn't conquest. It was disappearance. Where Klingons charge in with disruptors blazing, the Romulans disappear behind borders, treaties, and above all, their cloak. The neutral zone was their masterstroke, a border that was never a border, a line drawn in space designed not to prevent conflict, but to invite it. By refusing contact, by withdrawing behind the curtain, the Romulans forced the Federation to patrol endlessly, to pour resources into defending against an enemy that might never come. Sun Tzu once warned that a wise general makes the enemy expend his strength without gain. The Romulans institutionalized that idea for centuries. When the USS Enterprise first faced a Romulan bird of prey in Balance of Terror, the doctrine was laid bare. The ship struck from invisibility, delivered a devastating blow, and melted away into the void. To the Federation, it was less like facing a rival empire and more like being haunted by a ghost. And that was the point: to erode morale, to create paranoia, to win before battles were ever fought. But cloaking was never just a technology. It was a philosophy. A statement that information itself was the highest ground of war. If you could never be seen, then you couldn't be understood. If you could never be understood, you couldn't be defeated. Even treaties reflected this logic. The Treaty of Algeron didn't just restrict Romulan expansion, it banned Starfleet from developing cloaking technology altogether. Imagine that, a galaxy-class power willingly agreeing to blind itself in exchange for the promise of peace. That single clause may have been the Romulans' greatest victory. They convinced the Federation to give up the one tool that could have countered their doctrine. And this secrecy wasn't just about external enemies. It was about survival in a galaxy filled with neighbors who were stronger, louder, or more numerous. The Klingons could outfight them. The Federation could outbuild them. So the Romulans survived by cultivating an image that was bigger than their reality. Every ship unseen became a fleet imagined. Every silence from the Senate became a looming threat. They turned uncertainty into a weapon. And like Sun Tzu's Ghost Army, they taught their enemies to fight shadows instead of soldiers. The Romulans built their empire not on strength of arms, but on strength of secrecy. And as we'll see, this philosophy shaped not only how they fought their wars, but how they ruled their people, and how they haunted the Federation for centuries to come. If the cloak was the Romulans' philosophy, the Earth-Romulan War was where that philosophy became reality. In the 22nd century, humanity faced a war unlike any it had fought before. The Romulans launched drone-style attacks, long-range assaults, and devastating ambushes, all without ever showing their faces. In fact, no human saw a Romulan until nearly a century later. That absence was deliberate. The Romulans knew that if they could remain faceless, then fear itself would fight for them. Star Trek Enterprise gives us glimpses of this conflict. Remote-controlled vessels disguised as other ships, sneak attacks designed to destabilize alliances, and relentless pressure on supply lines. These weren't Klingon honor duels, nor were they Cardassian occupation campaigns. This was Sun Tzu's art of war: win through deception, weaken through distance, and always deny the enemy clarity. The result was a grinding, attritional conflict. Humanity didn't win through superior weapons, but through defense, patience, and sheer stubborn endurance. The Romulans couldn't overwhelm Earth, but Earth couldn't pierce the veil of secrecy. That stalemate produced one of the most significant outcomes in galactic history: the Treaty of Algeron, which not only established the neutral zone, but permanently etched paranoia into the Federation's identity. Think about what it meant. The Federation was founded in part because of fear of the Romulans. Member worlds knew that unity was the only defense against an enemy who thrived in shadows. The war may have ended in a Federation victory, but it was a victory defined by survival, not triumph. And the Romulans understood this. They didn't need to win territory outright. They had achieved something subtler, and perhaps more effective. They taught the Federation to build starships and starbases, always with the unseen threat in mind. Every patrol along the neutral zone, every intelligence network expanded, every conversation about the morality of cloaking technology, all of it tracks back to this war. Sun Tzu wrote, "Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting." The Romulans didn't break the Federation, but they ensured it would never stop resisting. Every shadow on a sensor, every unexplained signal along the border, every cloaked ship that might or might not be there, these became the Romulans' greatest weapons. The Earth-Romulan War wasn't just a conflict. It was the seed of centuries of paranoia, shaping both Romulan doctrine and Federation policy. It proved that a war fought in shadows could scar deeper than a war fought in fire. And those scars would shape everything that came after. The Romulans didn't just weaponize secrecy against their enemies. They turned it inward, binding their own people in the same doctrine of fear that defined their wars. At the heart of this system stood the Tal Shiar. To outsiders, they were the Romulan intelligence service, spies, assassins, shadow operators. But within the Empire, they were something far more insidious. They were the enforcers of paranoia itself. Ordinary citizens never knew who might be listening, who might be watching, or which friend might suddenly vanish after saying the wrong thing. The Tal Shiar ensured that secrecy wasn't only a military tactic, it was the foundation of Romulan society. This secrecy had another effect. It cut the Romulan people off from the Federation's greatest weapon, its ideals. For the Klingons, Cardassians, even Bajorans, the Federation was a visible alternative. They saw its culture, its prosperity, its freedoms, and they judged their own lives against it. But the Romulan populace rarely glimpsed that hope. By controlling borders, restricting travel, and keeping information locked behind state secrecy, the Empire shielded its citizens from comparison. The Federation's promises of freedom and unity never reached their ears, and that was by design. Where the Federation spread influence through soft assimilation, diplomacy, culture, the irresistible promise of shared prosperity, the Romulans countered with hard suspicion. The Federation convinced worlds to join by showing them paradise. The Romulans ruled their worlds by making alternatives invisible or unthinkable. Fear was the glue of their empire, just as hope was the glue of the Federation. Episodes like Face of the Enemy reveal how far this doctrine ran. Even loyal Romulan officers lived double lives, forced into deception as a way of survival. Later, in Deep Space Nine, we see the Romulans apply the same logic to their allies in the Dominion War. Cooperation always came wrapped in mistrust. If the Federation offered unity, the Romulans offered control. Not through trust, but through intimidation. And then there were the Remans, the clearest example of secrecy as subjugation. Hidden in minds and shadows, they were erased from the public view of the Empire, existing only as soldiers and tools. When Shinzon rose from the darkness, it was the inevitable consequence of a society that believed suppression was the same as stability. Sun Tzu wrote, "To subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill." For the Federation, that meant persuasion. For the Romulans, it meant paranoia. One empire turned strangers into allies by spreading their ideals. The other kept its people loyal by ensuring those ideals never reached them. Both methods worked, but only one could survive exposure to the light. The Romulan doctrine of secrecy and fear was powerful, but it was not invincible. In fact, it often collapsed the moment it faced transparency, coalition, or even the faintest touch of the Federation's ideals. The first cracks appeared with the Tomed incident. Details remain scarce, fitting for the Romulans, but what little we know suggests that secrecy backfired. The Romulans escalated tensions to the brink of all-out war, then suddenly withdrew from the galaxy stage for half a century. Their own doctrine, meant to intimidate, instead isolated them. Fear had bought survival, but it had also cost them relevance. While the Romulans hid, the Federation grew stronger, more united, and more visible to the wider galaxy. The Dominion War exposed those flaws even further. Cloaking devices and secretive maneuvers meant little against the transparency of alliances. The Federation, Klingons, and eventually the Romulans themselves found victory not by hiding, but by standing in the open. For a people defined by shadows, fighting alongside others, and fighting visibly, was a doctrine they had never prepared for. Their secrecy had become predictability. An enemy expecting a cloaked strike isn't surprised by it. And in a galaxy of shifting alliances, paranoia turned potential partners into reluctant allies at best. But perhaps the greatest failure of the doctrine came from within. Shinzon's coup was not the result of outside enemies, but of secrecy breeding rot inside the Empire. By keeping their people in darkness, denying them contact with Federation ideals, keeping them ignorant of alternatives, the Romulans ensured that when rebellion did emerge, it came not from reformers, but from shadows darker than their own. The Remans had lived in silence, invisible to the galaxy and even to their Romulan overlords. When Shinzon rose, it was proof that paranoia can control a population for decades. But eventually, shadows breed monsters. And here's where the Federation's quiet influence becomes most damning to the Romulan doctrine. Unlike the Klingons or Cardassians, ordinary Romulans had almost no exposure to Federation ideals during their Empire's height. Their secrecy shielded them. But once cracks began to form, through defections, through others like Commander Dunatra, through exposure during the Dominion War, those ideals finally slipped through. Hope, freedom, unity, the very things Romulan citizens had been denied, became visible. And once seen, they couldn't be unseen. Sun Tzu warned that if you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. The Romulans made a doctrine out of ensuring no one truly knew them, but in doing so, they blinded themselves to what their people would become. Their secrecy had protected them for centuries, yet the moment light broke through, their doctrine failed. Because fear can keep people silent, it cannot make them loyal. Even in failure, the Romulan doctrine left scars that reshaped the galaxy. For centuries, the Federation defined itself against Klingon aggression, Cardassian expansion, and eventually Dominion conquest. But the Romulans were different. They didn't just fight battles, they haunted them. The clearest example is the Treaty of Algeron, as I've stated. On paper, it was meant to end hostilities and preserve peace. In practice, it shackled Starfleet. By banning the Federation from developing or deploying cloaking technology, the Romulans achieved something extraordinary. They forced their greatest rival to blind itself. That single clause outlived governments, fleets, even the Senate itself. Decades later, when Voyager entered the Delta Quadrant, it still had no cloak. When the Dominion War began, Starfleet had to borrow a single cloaking device for its ship. The Romulans may have lost wars, but in that treaty, they won a victory no battle could ever match. The Federation also militarized in response to the Romulan threat. The neutral zone required constant patrols. Starfleet built listening posts, intelligence networks, and rapid response fleets, all because of an enemy that might, or might not, even be there. Every time the Romulans appeared, Starfleet was forced to escalate. Every time they vanished, Starfleet was forced to stay on guard. In this way, the Romulans shaped Starfleet's doctrine just as much as the Federation's ideals ever did. And the legacy also lingered. In the next generation, the Romulans re-emerged after decades of silence, reminding the Federation that fear does not fade. In Deep Space Nine, their eventual alliance came at a cost: secrecy, distrust, and a shadow campaign of manipulation. Even in Picard, long after their homeworld was destroyed, the Romulans remained defined by paranoia, a people fractured, scattered, and yet still clinging to the shadows as survival. Sun Tzu wrote, "If you knew the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles." The Romulans ensured the Federation never truly knew them. They built their power on secrecy, their society on paranoia, and their victories, they were built on fear. Even when those shadows failed, the legacy endured. The Federation became more militarized. The neutral zone became a permanent wound in the stars. And the Romulans themselves became an enigma that could never fully be conquered. This is the shadow they left behind. Not an empire of vast conquests, not fleets of unrivaled power, but a doctrine that haunted their enemies long after their fleets were gone. An empire that taught the galaxy to fear the unseen, and left that fear echoing into the next century.